So, Paul, I want to start with you. And so, my question is, I've followed the stem cell space for years. I used to work exclusively in stem cell ethics. And what I've noticed is when people talk about stem cells and then talk about expanded access or right to try or compassionate use or any of the myriad terminology that tends to get used, it seems to me that they're talking less about like an actual regulatory pathway for accessing unapproved medical products and more as sort of like an ideology or a philosophy or some sort of grounding principle about, being able to try different medical treatments, sort of irrespective of whether they're approved, unapproved, off label, currently in trials, etc. And I was just wondering if you could, sort of approach this from your perspective and tell us, like, am I just seeing things, or do you see this, and how do you really see this landscape laying out?
Sure. Yeah, I see it very similarly. I think there's sort of two sides to it. On the one side, as you were saying, there's sort of this philosophy that when it comes to cell therapies, this includes stem cells and other things related to cellular products, that there's sort of this philosophy that we should make those as accessible as possible, even if that's outside the domain of FDA regulations, things like that. And so there, within that domain, that philosophy, we have what we're calling stem cell clinics that, and now there are about 2,000 of these direct-to-consumer businesses in the US, all across the US. And as little as maybe 14 years ago, there were really none of them. So it's exploded on the scene. But in parallel, there's also some in the more legitimate space who are arguing that we just really need to make cellular therapies more accessible. And it's really more like an idea and a philosophy, as you were saying. And then on the other side of the coin, we do have those operating more within the FDA space, in terms of getting a clearance for an expanded access program, things like that. So I think on that side, there's some stuff going on there as well that's really interesting. And there's also some crosstalk between these two things, and there's some reverberations between the two as well. And we've even seen some universities now leaning towards that philosophy that more access is going to always be better, almost in a sense. And so over the years, I've been doing work in this space, mainly following the stem cell clinics that, again, are offering non-scientifically proven stem cell injections. Two examples of university activities really caught my eye in the expanded access space as well. And I was and still am concerned about them in some ways. So one of these examples was a stem cells for autoimmune disease program at Northwestern University. And some of this research is really promising and really provides some of the best hope for certain types of MS, for instance. But what was going on there in terms of they were doing clinical trials, and then they were also doing expanded access kind of in parallel. So there's sort of this parallel program going on. And for the expanded access program, you had to either have insurance coverage, which didn't come into play that often, but did sometimes, or you had to pay out of pocket up to $100,000 or $150,000 to participate in that program. And so there's a lot of complexity there in terms of access issues and, is it ethical to charge that kind of money? On the other hand, for some of these patients, there really were no other options. So it was a very interesting, complicated case. Ultimately, Northwestern shut that program down, and we don't entirely know why. But there are definitely some things there that made me concerned. The experimental offering was already being portrayed publicly as effective and I guess safe enough in a sense. And the trials were still ongoing. Again, we had people off study, some via compassionate use, perhaps some not via compassionate use, who are having to pay to get that. The second case is something that's still ongoing, and that's over at Duke University. They have an expanded access program for cord blood cells for different pediatric neurological conditions, including autism and cerebral palsy. And they're doing clinical trials in this space. And then again, in parallel, they have this expanded access program for kids. I think mainly the most common condition is autism. And to date, there really is not, I would say, sufficient evidence to really make this an encouraging route to go. And part of what makes it, again, a little bit unusual, I think, is that you have to pay as a parent for your child to get access to this cord blood cell infusion program. and the costs are around $15,000 per infusion. The other aspect to this that's really interesting in this Duke case is that they have a partnership with a for-profit publicly traded biotech company called CryoCell. And I've done some research on sort of this arrangement with Duke and CryoCell, and there's really some concerning, I would say, at least in my opinion, aspects to it on the financial side, where it feels like at least part of the driving force behind this expanded access program going into a direct consumer clinic is revenue related. The company at least really seems very enthusiastic on that side. So this all together, if we bring that all together, the things I've been talking about, makes for a very complicated space. We have a few thousand clinics, we have legitimate clinical trials, we have, FDA okayed expanded access programs, and it's all really in this complicated mixture together. So makes it very interesting, but there's exciting things, there's concerning things, so a lot going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that could be an hour discussion right there, which unfortunately we're not going to have time to
Sure.
do. But I mean, just to pull a thread out of there, what I hear is, there are these products that FDA is exercising regulatory discretion and saying, we are not going to be involved in this. And this is what people can buy, they can purchase in these clinics. And that's really, if you can pay for it, it is your ability to go and get it. And then there are stem cell based products that are under FDA jurisdiction that you really have to either be in a trial or an expanded access program to get. And just given how confusing expanded access is, or clinical trials are for people in general, I imagine when you have that sort of, well, it's a stem cell based product, but is it, under FDA jurisdiction or not, is probably super confusing for people. So, as an academic, this immediately raises concerns for me about education and, informed consent. Are people aware of, what they're getting through what way? And then you repeatedly mentioned the word payment, which of course then raises another concern for me, because one of the, sort of parts of expanded access says that you cannot profit from it, right? You can charge for direct cost. If it cost you $5,000 to make a widget, you can charge that patient $5,000, but you can't add on money to make a profit. And so when you're saying people are paying these astronomical sums of money to go into something, that immediately leads me to wonder, like, what are they paying for? Is that the cost of the cell-based product? Is that the cost of the product plus, it being reinserted into the body and kept in, good manufacture, safe storage facilities, or are there add-on costs there? So I think there's a lot there that seems like we could spend a very long time talking about it.
Yeah, and just one real brief follow-up based on the good points you were raising. There isn't necessarily a lot of transparency about the rationale behind a specific cost, like $100,000 or $15,000. And at least I haven't seen in the public domain a breakdown of like, 100% all goes towards just cost, or if some of this money is going elsewhere. The other point I wanted to raise is that there is a lot of therapeutic misconception, in some cases actually being encouraged by some of the clinic firms. And so they're really portraying experimental offerings as something that's already known to be, to be efficacious and help people. So that's really concerning. And then just finally, real quick, within the clinic domain, you mentioned the FDA's discretionary, they have the ability to have a discretionary period or approach. A lot of the clinics clearly actually are not within that discretionary umbrella. They're clearly non-compliant. And so, and the FDA, in fact, actually had a deadline for our cell therapy space of last May, when it was not going to do as much discretionary, enforcement anymore. That has long since passed. So I think there definitely are, I would say, hundreds of businesses that are clearly non-compliant. They're probably not going to be, in this discretionary domain anymore. And so a lot of us are just kind of waiting to see if the FDA will really amp up what it's doing in this space.
And I can only imagine how frustrating that is as someone who is a scientist who really thinks stem cell based therapies has, true, potentially revolutionary potential. So
Yeah,
I'm sorry about that.
it is.
Let me just add in one more piece when we're talking about, the lack of transparency or potential for confusion. is, when I talk about people traveling from country to country to access medical products, sort of the paradigmatic example I talk about is stem cells, and we talk about medical tourism to go get stem cells. And of course, that's because different countries do have different regulatory rules for stem cells. So I think that just adds on.
Definitely, that adds more complexity, and we've seen a real shift in the tide now. So the U.S. has actually now become sort of the stem cell tourist destination, whereas again, 10, 15 years ago, Americans were going elsewhere. Now people are coming from other countries here, and in part, it's just because there's so many clinics here that there's just a lot more choice, I guess, available if you do want to kind of roll the dice and take a risk.
Well, that's fascinating. But like I said, I can't spend an hour just on stem
For
cells, so
sure.
we'll come back to you. But I want to turn to Jordan and say, Jordan, I think anyone who's been paying attention to the literature has seen that there's this huge boom of interest in, the sort of therapeutic potentiality of psychedelics. And you're a clinician, you're also a researcher. I was just wondering if you could just sort of spell out for us just the basics of what's happening. Like what's being tested for what's been proven, where do we stand at the moment?
Sure. Yeah, and there's a lot happening. Everything from very basic science kind of research with these compounds, through to the clinical trial aspect and everything kind of in between, social science, humanities, et cetera. But certainly in what we're talking about for the clinical indications through the FDA track, the things that are furthest along is MDMA assisted psychotherapy for post-traumatic stress disorder, which is at least halfway through phase 3 trials now and has an expanded access program that's getting off the ground or has been approved. And then psilocybin for major depressive disorder, there's a few, there's two entities, one for-profit and one nonprofit, who are in the middle of phase 2 and phase 3 trials currently. So I think those are two indications are the furthest along. There's also been phase 2 level studies completed for psilocybin, treating cancer patients actually for end-of-life anxiety and depression, as well as a number of studies looking at psilocybin in the context of substance use disorders, especially for alcohol use disorder, but some other substance use disorders. And folks are looking at, there are other studies looking at other psychedelic compounds for other indications, but the ones I mentioned are the furthest along.
And so, just for people who may not be tracking this closely, and like I said, I'm no expert, can you just help us understand a little bit? So, there seems to be that there are some sponsors who are trying to get FDA approval for some of these products. At the same time, there seem to be legalization efforts at other places, which, is not trying to get FDA approval for a product. It's just trying to say, look, this has been treated as a criminally, possession and use as a crime, and let's get rid of that. Can you just like explain a little bit of what's happening?
Yeah, it's a little I mean the world of psychedelics is kind of a big tent, I would say, and there's multiple different things that are happening. On the one end is the medicalization of psychedelics, which is along the lines of what we talked about, clinical trials, pursuing FDA track for approval for specific indications. Of course, we can talk a little bit about this. What's different about psychedelics compared to most other investigational drugs is that they're actually Schedule 1 substances in the Controlled Substances Act, which adds in all kinds of complications in that domain. But on the other hand, there's, as you mentioned, a lot of state level and municipal initiatives that, from a drug policy standpoint, say, believe it was a mistake to schedule these substances in Schedule 1 to begin with. And states are saying, hey, look at there's medical benefits, the harms are low. We want to provide other legal pathways to access these drugs aside from the FDA path. So then you're seeing the range of initiatives from decriminalization to probably most notably the Oregon bill that was passed last year that actually creates a statewide program for supervised access to psilocybin therapies. So it's not exactly fully medicalized, and it's not fully just like legalizing it so that it's just freely available for street use, but trying to, you know, weigh out the harms, risks, benefits, and create some sort of framework. But that's outside of the explicitly the medical system.
So I said to Paul, when it came to stem cells, I just saw like rife opportunities for confusion. And I think I have to say the same thing with psychedelics, because it sounds like there's this shifting, like legal, political, legislative landscape at the same time that there's ongoing research. You mentioned that these products are Schedule 1, which means they're under the jurisdiction of the DEA, which means that you have this whole other entity involved. And I believe you said earlier that these products are not just being given as, like here's a product, it's being given in conjunction with, therapy, which I would imagine once you add all of that in, that's very confusing, not only for patients, but also for providers, especially providers who are contemplating expanded access, which I know you've said you have been thinking about with psilocybin and is being currently done with MDMA. So can you just, talk through a little bit about the challenges of offering these products through expanded access? And maybe I missed some, or maybe I'm overblowing. It's not as confusing as it sounds.
Yeah, sure. And I think, as I was listening to the last panel, and Jinsey Andrews, laid out a lot of the barriers to expanded access, and a lot of things actually apply here as well, though there are some additional barriers with the Schedule 1 aspect. But just to say, the model generally with certainly very clearly with MDMA, but essentially with psilocybin as well, these are not drugs that are given outside of clinical context. They're always supervised dosing sessions, limited number of dosing, and combined in a therapeutic context. And so it requires high degree, a lot of training goes in, for the MDMA protocol. I mean, it's MDMA assisted psychotherapy. So it's really a drug assisted therapy model. So you have to have providers, you have to have everything in place to manage the drug. You have to have the psychotherapy, you have to have the facility. It's quite a complicated, treatment model that's being piloted here. That's quite different from a standard drug models. And then the Schedule 1 piece adds, a lot of storage barriers, not only storage for the providers, but accessing the compounds. It can also add in some political considerations for the drug suppliers or potential sponsors, because if they're also pursuing FDA approval and rescheduling, given the complicated history around these compounds, they may be risk averse and not wanting to introduce any additional risk that could sort of interfere with the FDA phase 3 process. And then, of course, cost, that's been already discussed, is another huge issue here, because at least in part, the history of these drugs being scheduled actually map the sponsors, the sponsor for the MDMA assisted trials and expanded access program, as well as I mentioned the nonprofit sponsor USONA for psilocybin. So these are actually nonprofit drug companies, essentially, that are trying to do this. And so they also have limited resources to support expanded access programs. So for instance, in the MAPS program, though they've put a lot of resources into getting sites trained and set up to provide this, there still is the issue of access to patients, like who's going to pay for this. And essentially it's, there's grants, there's private funding, but mostly it's going to be on the patients, and these can be pretty expensive therapies to provide. So those are a few of the issues that face this field and expanded access.
Edith, when she was doing her introduction, mentioned that her company in the last year provided product to thousands of patients across, I think she said something like 64 countries. And it just, hearing what you're saying makes me think that sounds impossible almost in this context, in terms of having to have the trained therapist, having to navigate that many different regulatory regimes, not even to mention just the logistics of who is able to get to the clinic, get scheduled to see someone, etc. Do you just have thoughts about sort of like the equity of access piece?
Yeah, it's a huge issue. I think you would end up seeing maybe initially certain like hubs and centers that are well trained to provide these therapies and have, the expertise to deliver them. But there's been, a fair bit of discussion in the field around equity and access. I mean, along a number of lines, whether it be racial lines, socioeconomic status. So a lot of the, for instance, even the folks coming into the clinical trials, which generally are funded by the sponsors, there's been a real lack of diversity in the populations. We've been getting mostly Caucasian, mostly middle to upper class in terms of socioeconomic status. So that's an issue. 64 countries. Wow, I'm like that's a ways away for psychedelics. I think there's teams in Europe and Israel and North America, increasingly South America, but it's kind of slow. And given the drug laws, which apply pretty much worldwide, the stigma, and then the need for training for providers. I mean, there is a lot of hurdles to globalizing these treatments right now.
So there's so much more we could talk about, and I know there's currently a lawsuit about, can these products be used under right to try laws? I know at least one state has a proposed bill out there that would expand their state right to try law specifically to include psychedelics. So I'm hoping we can circle back and talk about some of that, and especially during the audience Q&A. But I want to head on to Edith now and just say, Edith, we've talked a bit about vaccines thus far today, but I was hoping that you could specifically talk about vaccines from the vantage point of, non-trial pre-approval access. And just for our audience, I want to remind them that whereas we have all now heard about Pfizer having a COVID-19 vaccine, I'm Team Pfizer. My vaccine came from Pfizer. I didn't get to choose it. That's just what they were offering, but I'm happy with it. But, Pfizer obviously has vaccines for other non-COVID indications. So does Pfizer offer expanded access for vaccines? Would it consider expanded access for vaccines? And I know what happened with COVID was a little bit of an anomaly. So can you just sort of talk people through, what you think about these and what you've seen, and you can even share stories from outside Pfizer. Just really this idea of vaccines and how they relate to expanded access.
Okay, thanks for that question. So as you already indicated here and intimated, that vaccines are different, right? They're preventative, and most of the criteria that we have, I mean, in our criteria for expanded access, vaccines do not fit squarely within those parameters because they are preventative. With that said, as with any aspect or any of the assets within our portfolio, we look to consider when we have requests such as this, what's the totality of the circumstances? What's the situation? You mentioned with COVID and the global pandemic. It was one of the questions the team really thought about. And we've heard others mention today as part of expanded access. When we have a development program, my team works closely with the clinical team to plan as we can for expanded access when we get to a certain point. And with COVID, where we were moving so quickly, we looked at, is expanded access the most efficient way, or what are the other options globally for us to make this vaccine when we have enough efficacy and safety data available to the largest number of people for benefit? So learning from the pandemic and looking at that mechanism, the emergency use authorization was a very efficient way for us to allow to work with the health authorities and allow the distribution of the vaccine to millions of people. You mentioned what's really the difference when we think about expanded access versus emergency use. When we think of expanded access operationally, you're looking at, for us, we manage it in two different scenarios. There's the physician who's requesting on a single patient request. That happens through our portal. An individual, they're treating, a patient can ask a question through the portal, and we can provide them with some information as best we can, trying to help that gap, as been mentioned, about information about expanded access. But the treating physician must make the request for a single patient use. The request is then sent to the medical expert on the team for consideration, and we make decisions one by one. There are also times where we will have a protocol where we'll treat a cohort of patients or within a country, there's a cohort of patients that's managed with that, as opposed to an emergency use protocol, emergency use authorization, which the health authority defines the parameters of how the medicine or the product will be used. It's distributed from, through that health authority as we continue to gather the data and seek a full approval for the medicine. The EUA path, as I mentioned, just really allowed us to provide access to the medicine and the vaccine in the most efficient manner. That kind of helps you.
Yeah.
That.
So, I mean, just to pick up on something you said, at least within the United States, our expanded access regulations are very clear that they're for treatment, diagnosis, or monitoring, and nowhere in there is prevention. So I know I got lots of calls from people saying, can you even use vaccines through expanded access? And I was able to say, look, there's precedent for it. It's happened before, but, this is really something that's up to FDA, it's up to courts, it's up to other people to decide, because it's not 100% in the letter of the law. And really, it's up to companies, because companies are the ultimate gatekeeper of who gets access to their products. So I think that's one important thing to hit. Another thing I want to pull out of what you just said is, throughout this entire day, we've been talking about this sort of balancing act between providing access, but at the same time not hindering gathering evidence, because we need to know if the product is safe and effective. And I think one thing that's important to bring up when it talks about vaccines is, I was just wondering if you could give people, just sort of a ballpark understanding of the difference of scope of a vaccine clinical trial versus a drug clinical trial. When we're testing a drug clinical trial, we may not have a lot of evidence until a series of trials is done. But can you just tell us a little bit about vaccine trials?
I mean, vaccine trials, there's the demonstration of efficacy and showing the immunity that's that happens, as well as then looking at the population and ensuring that you're conferring the benefit of the vaccine. So often the vaccine trials are done to demonstrate the efficacy, collect the safety data, but also demonstrating a population benefit. And often that can take several years to happen. We've been able to look at cohorts and accelerate that for COVID, and continue to gather that data to look for the benefit. You mentioned, you received some questions about, how could you get the vaccine through compassionate use, expanded access. And we did receive a small number of requests through our Pfizer Cares portal, and we worked with those individuals to help them connect to their local health authorities and help to ensure that they were able to get access through the emergency use authorization.
So I want to switch, while I have you on the hot seat, and talk also about gene therapies, because Pfizer is developing at least one gene therapy. So gene therapies, again, are different from what we sort of typically think about when we're thinking about expanded access. And I was just wondering if you could unpack that a little bit for our audience, especially if they're not familiar with gene therapies.
Yeah, I mean, many of the same points that were raised by Jordan and others earlier around ALS are going to some of the thoughts when we think about gene therapy, and that I and the team and Pfizer were thinking about how we could provide gene therapy through the expanded access pathway. I mean, gene therapy is a very novel, it's a unique mechanism of action. It's novel. The manufacturing of gene therapy is something that we are still learning to perfect and look to make available on a large scale as we build our manufacturing capabilities. With gene therapy, there's an immune response aspect that, when we think about where we've become, I think, excellent. You heard the numbers of patients that we're able to provide expanded access for. Those are mostly cancer patients, some rare disease patients with cardiomyopathy, patients with rheumatoid arthritis. We've been able to provide and have an access pathway. But here with gene therapy, we're still learning about the efficacy, the safety, and the ability that if we can only give a patient a one-time, a single-dose treatment, we don't want to limit them and have them not be able to benefit from another therapy. So we consider, and we've had input from our experts within Pfizer, as well as experts from our external experts to think about when is the right time, when will we have enough information that we know to ensure the patient's safety, that we can also ensure that the site, the physician have the expertise to administer gene therapy to the patient, because as mentioned, we still, there's a lot to understand about gene therapy, its administration, its side effects, its long-term effects, what type of data. We really, as in working with external partners, more and more, it seems that as we think about what our gene therapy policy will look like for expanded access, and as we evolve it, it will be unique itself in comparison to how we manage expanded access currently for oncology medicines or other medicines that we traditionally provide. Our policy today and where our gene therapy medicines are in the development, we do not provide expanded access to gene therapy, but we are continually evolving that policy. We look at it as our data and the clinical trials advance. And we're hopeful to find, as we've talked about a lot today, I've really appreciated the thoughtful discussion we've had today about how one day it will be possible and how can we do it, and not one day looking out far, but as mentioned, as the clinical trials advance, how we can do this in a way that provides it safely for patients.
Yeah, in one of my other jobs, when I'm not talking about expanded access, I work on a project on pediatric gene therapy. And I think the patient story that I heard relayed through a third party, through a patient advocate, that, sort of got me in the guts the most was about someone whose child got a gene therapy. This was in a trial. This was not through expanded access, but it was in a trial. There was no effect. There, fortunately, no harm, right? No safety concerns, but also no effect. And the parent then said, okay, how do I get this, how do I try it again? And it's sort of what is unique about gene therapies at this point in time is there is no trying again. It is a one time. And so, you're gambling of, do we do it now before it's approved as safe and effective? And maybe the answer is yes. Maybe it's such a progressive disease. Maybe the setting is so dire that the answer is yes. Or are you in a situation where you can say, like, let's wait because I don't want to prematurely expose my child to this one-time thing? And of course, gene therapies are not just for children. They can be for adults. There are different types of gene therapies. But I mean, just that one story just sort of sunk into me how gene therapies are different. So.
Yes. And I mean, Pfizer's not the only company. There's others that have looked to how to do this, and we learn from how they've tried, and we continue to work together. I mean, I think it's really an area where I've watched the industry come together to think about how do we do this, because these patients really, this is a true area where we can make a difference and help find a way. But we also need to, as we talked about today, maintain the ability to collect the data so that we know efficacy and safety and can get the medicine approved.
So I know we have lots of industry people in the audience, and I'm hoping during the Q&A maybe people can put their own experiences or concerns or thoughts with expanded access for gene therapy in the chat for us to talk about. I know one thing that I've talked to a number of companies about is if you have siblings who both have a genetic condition and one is trial eligible and the other one is not, is there a moral obligation to consider giving the non-trial eligible child the product through expanded access, under the theory that it would be very hard for a family to know that one child is receiving a potential unproven possible treatment and the other one is not? So maybe if people have experience or thoughts on that, they can throw that in the chat. But Carlos has been waiting so patiently, and I want to turn to him and to say, again, we've heard a lot about convalescent plasma today, and I'm sure you're going to have things to say about it as well. But first, I just wanted to open it up and say, I know that the world of blood products is not merely convalescent plasma. So can you just educate us a little bit about what are these blood-based therapeutics, and how do they differ from the more conventional treatments that we've been talking about in the rest of the day? Oh, and I think you might be muted. Are you muted?
Okay, I switched my microphone. Hopefully you can hear me now.
Yep, all good.
Great. So thank you. Yeah, just like blood is composed of more than just plasma, our office regulates all the different components of blood as well. So, that includes things that might be familiar to people who have ever been part of blood transfusion, red blood cells, platelets, plasma, but also things that might not be immediately familiar, other things that our office regulates that are involved in the collection and manufacture of blood products. That's things like devices used in the collection and manufacture of the blood components, donor screening tests, immunohematology reagents to test for antigens on certain blood components, devices used to prepare different modifications of blood, such as pathogen reduction. And then there are things that are biologics that are related to blood, things that like a hemoglobin-based oxygen carrier that might be being investigated as an alternative to red blood cell transfusion. So these are all different things, and some specific examples I can provide of things that have been considered under expanded access. One is rare phenotype red blood cells. So if a patient were to have an antibody against an antigen that's a very high prevalence in the US population, local or domestic blood establishments may not have blood available for that patient, and they may have to search internationally for where donors who lack that certain antigen might be more common. And that will involve importing a blood that may have not had the same regulatory standards as the United States. They may have different testing requirements, different donor qualification requirements compared to US blood establishments. And so that is typically done in coordination with a US-based blood supplier. The product might be something as simple as collected in a storage solution or device that's not something used in the United States. And those blood establishments will advise the physicians of those differences. We review those requests and we handle those on an emergency basis for when those patients need to have that rare phenotype red blood cells. Another example, something that's related to blood, but not necessarily a blood component in and of itself, is hemoglobin-based oxygen carriers. So this is something that might be considered when a conventional red blood cell transfusion is not an option for that patient. For example, a religious objection to receipt of blood products in certain populations. And so that's a complex scenario for those types of products. In certain indications, we have evidence from controlled trials that those products are not effective. But in the scenario where when you're comparing it to when blood is not, and those trials are typically compared to standard of care like a red blood cell transfusion. But if red blood cell transfusion is not an option for those patients, that adjusts the risk-benefit considerations. And so, we have these products where patients might have life-threatening hemorrhage, life-threatening anemia, and an objection to receipt of blood products or lack of compatible blood products. And so those types of products might be considered in that scenario. And I think that and the prior example are useful examples because something to consider for blood products is these are products that are typically used in emergency situations, and maybe not typically, but at least quite often used in emergency situations. And so something I wanted to highlight as a clinical reviewer myself in these is that we do have physicians on call 24 hours a day to be able to handle these kinds of emergency requests that come in. And we're able to provide information to the physicians and help guide them through that process of expanded access for these emergency requests. So even if it's a life-threatening situation, someone is, for example, bleeding to death, we are available for expanded access requests with pretty rapid turnaround. And that included even convalescent plasma when the requests were coming in the hundreds.
I'm actually really pleased that you brought in that sort of review time element. When Right to Try, the legislation was under discussion, there was a sort of urban legend out there that the FDA could take routinely more than 30 days to review an expanded access request, which we knew that was not accurate. But I'm not an FDA reviewer. I don't work in the FDA and see how quickly these things happen. Can you just give us a sort of estimate of, in a case of an emergency situation, how long this process might take just on the FDA side? Of course, there's going to be a whole nother part of, if there's a sponsor, you might have to talk to the sponsor. If there's an IRB, you need to talk to the IRB. But just the FDA side, are you able to give us a ballpark of what that would take?
Yeah, I can. And obviously, you mentioned there are other components, contacting the manufacturer that might be involved. But to give you some perspective, when that request comes in, that we do have either during the day or after hours through our Office of Emergency Operations. Once they reach the reviewers, which we are on call, again, someone is covering 24 hours a day, we would immediately reach out to those physicians. Those physicians are able to discuss this clinical scenario with us. We're able to, in some cases, submit any necessary paperwork, but oftentimes a conversation with them can be sufficient. And we are able to do this, within an hour for many of these requests. For convalescent plasma, I know this is a topic I'll probably get asked to touch on again soon, but even when we had a large volume of requests coming in the hundreds a day, I think that at one point when we were starting looking at our turnaround time for these individual patient requests in the early pandemic, we had meetings turnaround times of 20 to 30 minutes, being able to get back to the physicians. And there were tens to hundreds of requests a day.
And just on that, when the FDA gets, perhaps not in an emergency situation, but when it gets a request for a single patient expanded access, does the FDA do any sort of investigational work to see if there's an eligible clinical trial that patient could get into? Like, wow, that hospital actually has an ongoing trial, why don't you try that? Or does the FDA just look at the sort of risk-benefit ratio?
So certainly there's a regulatory requirement around the ability to have access of a patient having the ability to be in a randomized controlled trial. I should say that these same group of reviewers that would request these emergency requests, these physicians in these review divisions, are also going to be the review divisions that review the products in that space. So when there are ongoing trials as part of the development of those products, we will be aware of those trials. And so there have been some scenarios where patients have been eligible for trials, and we try and steer them in that direction.
So I have one more question for you, Carlos, and then I think Jordan and Paul might want to chime in on this as well. But you mentioned, I'm used to talking about sponsors, right? Drugs are being brought to potential market, being developed by a biopharmaceutical entity, oftentimes, that I refer to as the sponsor, or sort of alternatively the company. And you're talking about manufacturers. So can you just sort of talk about the difference here, about the fact that there is no one sole entity from which you can get these blood products, and how that differs?
Yeah, I think this is an important point for blood and blood components. These are not a single sponsor developing. There's no single ownership of this product or a cohesive central development plan necessarily for certain types of blood components. And to give some perspective on the scale, I think that physicians and many of the general public here who go to their blood centers and donate know the diversity of the blood establishments that are out there. This ranges from everything from a small hospital-based blood bank to a large multi-regional blood establishment that might have donor centers across a certain region. The scale, there are more than 800 what are called registered and more than 900 licensed blood establishments in the United States. So it's a very large network of blood establishments that are collecting or manufacturing these products. And the difference between registration and licensing is probably not important to the discussion of expanded access, but just so that groups from registered blood establishments are subject to the same requirements for good manufacturing practice for blood, even if they're not a license. So the license is required for entry of those products into interstate commerce, and it means that they've submitted data to us to support that licensure. But they're going to be subject to the same regulatory requirements, and that's important. Those regulatory requirements, when I talk about this huge network of blood establishments, not the Wild West. There are blood-specific regulations for manufacturing of blood, for qualifications of donors, for registration, standards for specific blood components like plasma, like platelets, that have to be met in order for those products to be collected and manufactured.
Thanks, Carlos. And the reason I mentioned Jordan and Paul is I sort of see similarities here in terms of there's no one single locus of product. So can you just speak to sort of any source control issues in terms of, if say Northwestern is doing a stem cell based expanded access program, is there any sort of vetting going on of what those products are and how they've been, uh, you know, taken care of safely, et cetera? Or is this, as Carlos was sort of talking about, sort of a federated assortment of entities, each, well, in Carlos's case, he's talking about there are very strict rules, but I'm wondering if that's the same in these other contexts or not.
Yeah, in the stem cell space, there's sort of, again, two sides to it. When you mentioned Northwestern and then also Duke and some of the other universities in the space, it is extremely carefully controlled. And not all that information is necessarily in the public domain, but they're the sponsors slash manufacturers are, my impression is they're being extremely careful. But then we have the whole other side of the clinics, which can be very tiny firms, but are still, can be sponsors. And they're even arguing about the word manufacturer because they want to argue their product is actually this sort of like natural autologous or the patient's own cells that is not even really manufactured. They're just isolating it. And there's a whole debate, and there are even court cases about resting on that word of manufacture. Is something a drug, not a drug? And so that's where I think it gets much more complicated. And again, we still have one court case here in California that's pending right now. It's with the judge that really rests on whether, for instance, stem cells or cell mixtures from fat tissue are a drug or not a drug. If they're not a drug, they're not even, I guess, manufactured in a sense. They're just isolated.
Thanks, Paul. And Jordan, I mean, I guess the same sort of question, right? You can have sponsor produced psilocybin from a facility, but you could have psilocybin from other, entities. So just how would this play out in the expanded access setting?
Yeah, I mean, with psilocybin in particular, it's I would say this issue is a bit confusing because, of course, this compound grows naturally in mushrooms that are found ubiquitously around the globe. And then as far as in the research space, I mean, there was chemists making this for the early clinical trials, pure synthetic product. Then there was the GMP grade substance that is now needed for higher level trials, but then the sponsors of the larger trials are now sort of trying to have their own drug product that's, sort of somehow its own formulation of the psilocybin or MDMA compound. So at least for expanded access, it's clear that you would need like a GMP grade drug product, but that doesn't necessarily have to come from the same sponsor that's pursuing necessarily the phase 3 trials. There may be a different access points. And then, additionally, there are, in Canada, actually, there were a number of patients exemptions granted to their Controlled Substances Act that actually allowed for patients to procure their own mushrooms, actually, to use in a therapeutic context. Or in Oregon, they're coming up with their own scheme for safe production that would look different because they're not moving through the FDA track. So it is a little confusing, but I think for expanded access, there would need to be a GMP option that's available, though, again, it would have to go through FDA and also DEA, again, comes into picture, which is, you mentioned right to try earlier, has complicated that issue specifically because they needed the DEA to basically give their blessing to ship the product to Washington where this was going to happen. And the DEA said, well, we can't, unless there's a specific exemption, we can't do that. So
yeah. So right to try is a piece of legislation that cuts the role of the FDA out of access to unapproved medical products for the most part, but it is silent as to the role of other agencies. And if you have something that like DEA has a role to play, it is now a question subject to litigation as to what's going to happen. So I think we'll all have to wait and see what happens here. Jordan, while I have you, there's a really interesting question in the chat, and it is posed to you as well as other people, which is, do you think the perception of many of these products as quote unquote natural affects the sort of philosophy of prioritizing access over regulation, or influences how people consider their possible risk? you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think certainly occasionally natural products can be conceived of as safe, as somehow safer, and then but in the case of say psilocybin, there's like, well, are you using the quote natural product or a synthetic version of that? And even within the psychedelic community, people batter around this question of, is it better to use the natural plant-based psychedelics versus synthetic um, compounds that were made in the lab like MDMA or LSD versus the natural uh, drugs like psilocybin. So it definitely does enter the debate in different ways, and sort of this is, I think, where social science is also very helpful, and sort of tracking it's political, ethical questions that end up influencing this.
I think that was definitely something we saw with regard to convalescent plasma, in terms of lots of people saying, just let me have it. It's not going to hurt me, and it might help me. And it was just sort of like this default assumption that it wasn't going to hurt them. Carlos, I wonder if you have any thoughts on either the convalescent plasma program, which I know we've talked about repeatedly today, but also just sort of, how patients view the risk or benefits of blood products as compared to others.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, yeah, it would be easy to talk for hours about the experience in convalescent plasma. I think there's been so much good discussion today, and the convalescent plasma story is sort of a lot of the issues in expanded access compressed over a very short period of time, and happening at a scale that hadn't been seen before. So, there are some, in terms of risk benefit, your specific question, there's some lessons learned about convalescent plasma and expanded access in convalescent plasma. And I think it's instructive to think about them as those related to expanded access, and then there's the scientific lessons learned. With respect to your question about monitoring risk benefit, I think it's useful to think about the different types of expanded access that were used for convalescent plasma. The pandemic started in the spring, and expanded access started as individual requests. And these would come in the first few days as a few requests that quickly became tens of requests, and that quickly became hundreds of requests. And we recognize that need. And I think Dr. Marks earlier today talked about the problem with that being sustainable and continuing to provide access. I think also in terms of monitoring risks, it was also a limitation. With hundreds of individual requests, it becomes difficult, if not impossible, to collate adverse event data in real time so that we can have continuous safety monitoring. Whereas with the expanded access program that was larger, with a central sponsor, we were able to monitor adverse event data in much closer to real time and see if there are signals. There are rare risks to blood transfusion that have to be weighed against the known and potential benefits, like any therapy. And some of the risks in plasma transfusion can be rare, but quite serious. Things like transfusion-related acute lung injury, particularly in patients who have a pre-existing pulmonary illness like COVID-19. So it's something we paid close attention to, and was useful in a larger expanded access program to be able to look for any signs that was happening in increased frequency than what was compared to baseline. Blood transfusion has, on the flip side, has the benefit that transfusion reactions to blood components are relatively well characterized. There are a set of known complications of blood transfusions that we know common signs and symptoms associated with them. We have an idea of the certain frequency of these types of reactions. And so having that information as a baseline is a useful starting point, but always limited in your ability to clearly extrapolate that to a new population. So convalescent plasma had to be studied in well-controlled trials. Our office recognized and really prioritized review of INDs for randomized controlled trials at the same time. There's a lot of talk earlier today about the effects of the expanded access programs on the ability to generate evidence quickly. And I think there's a lot to think about in terms of how could it be done differently to make sure that you're able to both achieve the goal of providing access and generating the evidence. I think the common theme of the day, But in terms of the regulatory side of that for convalescent plasma, we were turning around our randomized control trials as quickly as we possibly could. Review cycles that would normally take 30 days, trying to compress that down to 2 or 3 days so that trial sites could get up and running as quickly as possible. That said, some of that rush may have led to a fragmentation as everyone submitted their own trial rather than putting together a larger, more pragmatic trial that might generate higher quality, better powered evidence. At the same time, the pandemic shifted. So places that planned those initial trials, as the pandemic waned there, then it was suddenly somewhere else. Now they've got to bring in new sites because they have lower enrollment. And it's always kind of constantly playing catch up in that process. So there's some of the barriers in the randomized control trial that the expanded access continued to provide access while those things were being worked out. I think that anytime we consider a larger expanded access program like that, a lesson learned in the future is to consider how, and Dr. Marks commented on this, as it grew larger than we expected, to think more prospectively about how this has been designed at the same time to be able to maintain that balance of providing access and continue to generate high quality evidence.
Yeah, I mean, Paul mentioned earlier the situation in which you can have a side-by-side trial and expanded access program. And I think for many of us, that is sort of, what we would like to see. And the difficulty there is just how do you structure those two things so that, you're prioritizing that the people who can be in the trial are in the trial so that we can get that safety data, that efficacy data as quickly as possible to minimize exposure to a potentially unsafe, potentially ineffective product, but at the same time allowing people who really cannot get into that trial access to it until that data is known. So yeah, go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, it's really interesting when we have these situations where there's a trial and an expanded access program. And I can see how there could be benefits from that, but I've also seen complications where the people who are being treated off study, and this could include formal expanded access programs or just more informal kind of off study treatment, then sometimes we'll communicate with the people who are in the trial. So, or make public statements that the offering is already known to be efficacious and safe. Meanwhile, there's this trial going on and the people there in the trial are being potentially influenced by what's going on in parallel. And also the people who are getting the off study or expanded access intervention, like I said, at least in the cell therapy space, often have to pay for that. And then over here, it's a different situation, so it just can make for a very complicated but interesting dynamic.
And of course, in the chat in one of our earlier panels, we had people saying, is it even ethical to have people randomized to placebo when outside of the trial people are getting just straight access to the desired product? I want to go to Jordan because I just want to take advantage of the fact he is a practicing clinician. We're getting ready to have a panel of clinicians and other stakeholders, but as our clinician here right now, how would you think about what Paul's just talking about? Like if you have an open accruing trial and you have a patient in front of you, what's the process that you go through in terms of thinking, what do I do with this patient? We all know regulatorily you need to put patients into trials if they're eligible. But that if they're eligible is a little loosey-goosey, right? Maybe they're too far away for the trial site to be convenient. Maybe they don't have a caretaker who can bring them in, etc. So just what sort of process would you think through if both of those options were available at the same time?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it's maybe, so clearly there's some differences in the cases that the conditions that we're looking at, namely depression and PTSD, which are unfortunately just so prevalent in our society that there are so many patients. The wait list to get into psychedelic trials is just insane. And so there's, at least as of right now, there's really is very limited numbers of clinical trial spots for these therapeutics. And
that's fascinating. I didn't know that. So see, I just learned that. That's amazing. I imagine many drug developers would be envious of having a wait list to get into their trials. So okay.
Yeah, it's, I mean, there's been a lot of interest generated in the media and amongst the public for these treatments. Maybe even the hype is, folks like Michael Pollan have written about this. So maybe, yeah, I mean, there's been good and bad things that have come out of that. But so we have a lot of demand and very limited numbers of spots. And even in the trials I've been involved with, very few people who even apply or express interest are able to get into the trials. So, I mean, from that perspective, I think we are missing out on some opportunities, not only to treat patients, but also to generate some of that additional evidence that could happen outside of those trials. The criteria have been very stringent, and so it would be interesting to see more expanded access programs or right to trial laws come in with some framework to continue to collect data. And we've talked about the tensions in doing that. But for instance, the site I'm involved with for our NDMA expanded access program, we're specifically trying to recruit in this case people of color who've experienced racial-based trauma, which is something that wasn't adequately hasn't been studied very well in the actual phase 3 trials. So hopefully, we're going to serve a useful, the data we'll collect will be useful in informing the field.
Great. And I got a direct message from someone in the audience that said, I made a big deal with Edith about the sort of like one-time nature of gene therapy when it comes to expanded access. But could people comment on sort of the flip side of that, which is expanded access for a product that needs repeat administration, particularly if that repeat administration is something that is, time or labor intensive or not, it's not an oral medication, in other words. So anyone want to weigh in on sort of just the logistics or the equity implications or anything of having expanded access for these more, frequently used but not necessarily easily used products? Yeah, Edith.
I mean, I can make just a general comment. Like we've had a number of programs where the medicine is given continuously. And so by giving expanded access, we've really committed to treat that patient through the duration. And we take that seriously and we provide the medicine. I think it's, it's an important decision when you think about it. Or if you think in some of the oncology regimens, right, you're being dosed for so many weeks off and on, and that continues. So we have many examples where we're providing expanded access on a repeat, and we have, patients are receiving their expanded access as almost like a refill that you would at the pharmacy. Probably about half of our patients last year were receiving the medicine that way. I think for us, really, as we think about it, is looking at that benefit risk and patient safety is first. And knowing that we can provide the medicine and we have enough data, and then thinking about all the rest around how do we operationalize it and get the medicine. How do you get it supplied, or there's the right accuracy, the right administration? Can we provide it? It doesn't have special cold chain, to get it to a patient. So some thoughts there. I think I saw Paul raise his hand too, maybe. No, okay. Yeah, so but I mean, we have many examples of repeat therapies, and in some ways, that's been easier for us than this scenario, which provides a dilemma for us in thinking that we certainly wouldn't want to have a patient provided with expanded access and then make them ineligible when the right treatment comes along, which could be the following week.
Well, we are almost out of time, and I told the panelists that I'm going to ask them each for their closing thoughts. So while they muster their closing thoughts, I want to give one speed round question to Jordan, and then Jordan, in return, I'll ask you your closing thought last. So the speed round question is, there's a question in the chat saying, you talked earlier about in psychedelics it's sort of a big tent, and the question is, are some of the more fringy activities in that tent impairing the ability to really have people think of psychedelics as a form of, valid treatment, or do you think everything can coexist easily?
It's a very good question.
And it's speed round, so sorry, speed round.
Okay, it's difficult. I saw if they were specifically asking, I think someone was asking about ketamine clinics specifically, because that's really where that is a legally available treatment. So I think it's like kind of a double-edged sword. I think it's on the one hand, We've seen some like profiteering in those spaces, and people offering, it becomes like a spa-like treatment and doing like kind of some dubious kind of things. On the other hand, it also, because it's legal and could be used in off-label, for instance, you can see some innovation happening in, for instance, like developing group clinics, models of group administration, for instance, which isn't done in the trials, which helps with access and collecting, the good clinics doing that are collecting some data to show that that's actually feasible. So, you can see some innovation when the product's out there and available for clinical use, and hopefully some additional data. But definitely there's, the financial interest can also really complicate matters as well. So
Great, that's interesting. All right, Carlos, you first, then Paul. What's your final thought for us at the end of this uh, interesting panel and getting near the end of a long day?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges for blood products that I wanted to mention is that you're dealing not only with heterogeneity of a patient population, but also heterogeneity of a product. And you're going from one donor to one recipient, and there can be features in both of those individuals that would lead to benefits or lack of benefits for a given therapy. And so those kind of things are challenges to blood components. They're challenges for expanded access. I think that having some of the features of expanded access that we experience for convalescent plasma and bringing that to rapid rollout of randomized controlled trials really is a lofty but important goal, so that you can continue to provide access while generating high quality evidence. And I think that Dr. Marks talked about some of the things that we would have maybe done differently in terms of prioritizing testing early, and thinking about how we would deal with the expanded access as a group. But I think that it's important that we assure the quality, the safety of the products being used, even if it's a challenge due to the heterogeneity of donors.
Thanks, Paul. And then Edith, quick final thoughts?
Yeah, just going along with what Jordan said in his space, in the stem cell and cell therapy space, we really do have a problem with profiteering. And I would just say, especially in the expanded access component of that, it really worries me when participants are viewed more like customers. And that's something that we're seeing more of. And Alison, you earlier had mentioned that expanded access shouldn't be the basis for making profit. But some in the cell therapy space are arguing that actually that should be allowed and maybe is allowed because of vagaries in the regulation. So that's another thing to look for, is whether or not we'll see more arguments for it being okay to profit off of expanded access.
Edith?
So throughout the day, we've heard lots about how expanded access provides hope. And before joining Pfizer, I practiced as a pediatric oncology pharmacist, and I remember requesting expanded access for patients within the hospital, and it was a very difficult process. And I think I've been now at Pfizer for 20 years, and I've watched the process become simpler for different areas. And the topics today, my final thought is, I just really value and want to thank you again, Alison, and everyone who worked on this meeting today, because we've had an opportunity to bring together many experts and talk this through. And we think that even through the virtual setting, we've had some, I think, very thoughtful discussion and ideas on how we can advance some of these difficult situations. And I know working together, where these things seem impossible, we'll be able to identify some solutions and continue to advance. Because I don't think 20 years ago, we wouldn't have been talking about how, one company, Paul from Novartis mentioned that 10,000 doses, 10,000 patients, and I'm talking over 4,000. So I think it's remarkable what we're achieving, but there's so much more that we can do.
Thanks. Jordan?
Yeah, it's just, one thing that hasn't been mentioned, which is the most obvious kind of indication in the case of psilocybin for expanded access, is for dying patients with cancer. We already have phase 2 level data. There's at this point, no one moving forward with phase 3 level trials for that indication. And so I see that as really an obvious place to go with expanded access. So I look forward to seeing some more applications in that area, as Canada has already been moving forward in that domain. So excited to sort of see what happens in this space.
Thank you all so very much.